All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to this special event, Poetry in a Divisive World, a conversation with Jericho Brown, Yevgeniy Breyger, and Georg. For those Berry College students here for cultural events credit, we'll post a link during the Q&A following the reading, which will take you to a short survey to complete within 24 hours. In the summer of 2019, all four of us were on, sorry, Irina, might you mute? Perfect, thank you. In the summer of 2019, all four of us were part of a group of 6 American poets and 6 German poets who were invited to participate in translation work sponsored by House for Poesy and the International Berlin Poetry Festival. Each American poet was paired with a German poet, Jericho Brown with Georg, Yevgeniy Breyger with me, and each pair was joined by a professional translator who provided the critical work of gloss or line by line literal translations of the poems. We then worked together over several intensive days to create artistic translations of each other's work, which we all read at a wonderful evening event at the festival. The culmination of the work was an anthology of the 12 poets' work in both languages, published by Das Wunderhorn in Germany. Our plan had been to welcome these poets to the US, to host them in in-person events. But then 2020 happened. Now we welcome them and you, our international audience, to this virtual space instead. 2020, of course, brought us COVID, lockdowns, and tragedy. It was also marked by the continued rise and emboldening of white supremacy in the US and enduring antisemitism in Germany, as well as a racial reckoning with systemic racism and violence against Black people in the US and beyond. Now, on the eve of what many people see as the most critical US election of our lifetimes, we are gathered here to talk about what role the art of poetry has in such a divisive world. Should it take an activist role or offer an alternative to political divisiveness, or does it do both? To begin, I will briefly introduce the 3 panelists. Then all 4 of us will share one brief poem and its translation from our collaborative work, which will be generative for our following conversation. I will ask all questions in English. The poets may respond in English or German. If in German, our translator, Irona Bondas, will give us a translation in English. At the end of the conversation, we will take questions from the audience via chat. The hosts will be able to see what you type there, including our translator. So now to introduce our poets. Yevgeniy Breyger is the author of 2 books of poems. His debut collection, Plushchekamonda, was published by Cookbooks in 2016 and was selected as one of the poetry books of the year in the Literaturhaus Berlin and one of the best poetry debuts of the year in the Haus für Poesie. In 2018, he received the Munich Poetry Prize's 2nd prize, and in 2019, he won the Leons und Lena Prize. His 2nd book of poems, Gestohlene Luft, has just been released. Breyger's atmospheric work, remarkable in its attention to sound, has been described as creating aesthetic kingdoms. He has published in such magazines and anthologies as Jahrbuch der Lyrik, Lyrik von Jetzt, Belletrista, and Edit. In 2011, he won the Meyerbaum Eisinger Literature Prize, and in 2012, he was a finalist in the 20th Open Mic. Jericho Brown is the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently The Tradition, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Whiting Award. Brown's first book, Please, won the American Book Award, and his second, The New Testament, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award. His third collection, The Tradition, in addition to the Pulitzer, won the Patterson Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Brown's work questions why and how we've become accustomed to terror in private and public spaces, from mass shootings to rape to the murder of unarmed people by police. His poems have appeared widely in venues such as the New Republic, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Time Magazine, as well as several volumes of the best American poetry. He is the director of the Creative Writing Program and a professor at Emory University. Georg Less is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Schlossgewischt, Parvasitum Pressa, and De Whole Hand Musikalität. His love of the horror genre echoes through his work, in which creatures stroll beside unnamed figures and horror film directors. His awards include the 2013 Working Scholarship of the Berlin Senate and the 2014 GWK Promotion Prize for Literature. In 2016, he was awarded the Promotion Prize of the Federal State of North Rhine-Westphalia for young artists. Less lives in Berlin. So I'd like to invite Georg and Jericho to read now, beginning with Georg's poem and Jericho's translation.
Georg is still muted.
Okay, I can speak now. Undercut. Gänsehaut, weil du von Haut, bevor du vom Fell sprichst, äußertest du einen Mungo, aufgeschwemmt und fürchterlich und unterm Haar treibt lose ein Gesicht. Seins oder deins, ich schneide das nie wieder, dass das kein Mungo sei, versichern selbst die Eltern, das, nein, ist niemals unser. Du hast dich geborgen gefühlt, wie von einer Schere umarmt. Unser Fell sprießt dazwischen noch voller und unsere Luftnot darunter gemischt, weil du von der Nordsee, von Expeditionen, bevor du vom Schiff sprichst. Das Fell schlägt darüber zusammen, hält dicht. Am Ufer Nummer 3 mit einer wunden Sprache nur, einer Gattung und Export von Logik, was ich nicht auszusprechen weiß, nehme ich trotzdem in den Mund.
The haircut. Goose flesh, because you speak of flesh before you speak of fur. When you say mongoose, bloated and terrible, I see your hair, your cheek, and know I would never groom that animal, though even the beasts who bred it would not claim it, though the 2 of us be hugged by a pair of scissors. Aren't we still safe if breathless, if our fur sprouts thick between us? Goose flesh, because you speak of expeditions, because you speak of the north before you speak of the ship. A wave of fur collapses over that ship and holds tight toward another shore where language is as sore and particular as a furry export of logic, where I only feel what my dry mouth cannot utter. And I will read a poem This is my poem, Stand. Stand. Peace on this planet, or guns glowing hot. We lay there together as if we were getting something done. It felt like planting a garden or planning a meal for a people who still need feeding. All that touching or barely touching, not saying much, not adding anything. The cushion of it, the skin and occasional sigh, all seemed like work worth mastering. I'm sure somebody died while we made love. Somebody killed somebody Black. I thought then of holding you as a political act. I may as well have held myself. We didn't stand for one thought, didn't do a damn thing. And though you left me, I'm glad we didn't.
Thank you. Yevgeniy, can you read your poem next? Kingdom of the Small Fish.
Am I gonna get a translation?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh,
I have one. I have one.
Yes, you are going to get a translation.
Okay, for Jericho, Widerstand. Frieden auf diesem Planeten oder Gewehr glühen, so lagen wir beieinander, als brächten wir was zustande, das Gefühl, einen Garten zu pflanzen oder ein Mahl für ein Volk anzurichten, das immer noch gefüttert werden muss. All dieses Berühren oder beinahe Berühren, wenig Aussagen, nichts hinzufügen, das Kissen daraus, raus die Haut und aufstöhnen dann und wann. Alles schien Arbeit, die sich lohnte zu meistern. Für mich steht fest, dass jemand starb, während wir uns liebten. Irgendwer tötete irgendwen Schwarzen. Ich erwog, dich festzuhalten als politischen Akt. Ich hätte ebenso gut mich selbst festhalten können. Für keine einzige Idee standen wir, taten kein Stück. Und obwohl du mich verlassen hast, bin ich froh, wir taten es nicht.
Thank you so much. Deepest apologies for that. Yevgeniy, would you like to read your poem next in the German?
Ja. Königreich des kleinen Fischs. Der Tag wird von Scherben zu Abend getragen. Trockene Erde zwischen den Zähnen erinnert ans Lösen des Kalksteins von Klippen, erfasst von vergangenen Zeichen der Hand eines Toten. Sie gräbt in Archiven nach Namen, wie Tropfen von Säure, unnütz auf Stein, wird schwebend der Abend zur Nacht getragen. Die Toten sind nachts nicht sie selbst. Also schläft sie, also denkt sie im Schlaf an die adernden Blättern des Ahorns, durch die ohne Eile das Leben entweicht, in kleinen Portionen, ans Schwanken magerer Körper, an Strömungen, die plötzlich verschwinden und Flüsse in Seen verwandeln, den Gestank, der sich bildet. Die Nacht, wie sie ist, wird zum Morgen getragen.
And this is my translation of Yevgeniy's poem, Kingdom of the Small Fish. In shards, the day's shadows to evening. Between the teeth, dry earth recalls limestone shearing from cliffs as if scythed by a dead hand. She digs in archives for names. Like drops of acid, fruitless on lime, the hovering evening shadows tonight. At night, the dead are not themselves, so she sleeps. So she thinks in her sleep of the maple leaf veins through which life slowly leaks out in small measures, of the swaying of gaunt bodies, of currents which suddenly vanish, diminishing rivers to stagnant lakes rank with rot. The night, as it is, shadows to morning. All right, and I'm going to read my poem, Still Life with Zodiac Boat and Glacier Lagoon. A bowl of white light, spiked moraine peaks, debris veined, black ash and graveled till, blue milk fins calving into melt. Too much to stay against, one's own weight borne by speed, by wind, not weather, but the fast forward of a century on fire, pulled forth by my own eyes burning for sheared sapphire, by the pull cord's raveling wick with which I lit this engine, this small, blind body of need. Thank you all for sharing those beautiful poems and translations.
And you have to read your translation.
Oh my gosh, I'm just rushing ahead here. Please, please let me hear your beautiful translation, Yevgeniy.
Stillleben mit Zodiacboot und Gletscherlagune. Eine Schale weißen Lichts, Baiserspitzen mit Schuss, Adern aus Schutt, schwarze Asche, Geschiebelehm, milchblaue Flossen gebären ins Wasser ein Kalb. Zu viel dagegen zu sagen, unser Gewicht getragen von Eile, von Wind, ohne Wetter, dafür das Vorspulen eines Jahrhunderts in Flammen, worauf meine Augen stieren wie reine Saphire, vom verknoteten Docht der Kordel aus, die ich benutze, den Motor zu zünden, diesen kleinen, blinden Körper Bedürfnis.
So much. Beautiful. So now I'd like to begin our conversation with asking each of you how you think your work does respond, if it does respond, to this political moment that we're living in, this time of divisiveness and chaos. So would anybody particularly like to start the conversation? I think Jericho looks like he wants to start.
Yeah, that's exactly what was happening. I was looking like I wanted to start.
Yep.
So if the question is how
Mm-hmm.
it responds, it's sort of harder. It's harder to answer. You know, you sort of are aware that you're making use of your entire life in your poems. You know, I don't ever want to let anything go. I don't want to have this sort of dam. You know, I need all the water of poetry to flow to me. And so I think, and I think sometimes I work with this with my students, you know, they'll put certain dams up like, oh, I can write about everything, but not that, or I can write about everything, but not that. And generally, if you have in your mind something you don't want to write about, like you've really thought there's this one thing and whatever happens, I can't write about it. That's probably what you should be writing about because that thing probably has all kinds of amazing magical syntax and language attached to it for you. So I don't really think of myself as a poet engaging with the political moment on purpose. I think of myself as a poet who tries to write the poems I'm given. And the poems I'm given, of course, intersect with that political moment because just like I can write a poem about making a sandwich because making a sandwich is a part of my life, I can write a poem about going to vote and having to stand in line for a very long time to do it because that is also a part of my life. And those things are also a part of so many other people's lives, standing in line for things that we shouldn't have to stand in line for, or making sandwiches so that we can eat. So I'll start there.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting in your poem, and when you write, I thought then of holding you as a political act. And the sense of the political is, of course, so large. Who you love, I'm talking about the generic you. What you care about is also a political act. Yes.
Yeah, and often what we care about is put at risk for what seem to be political reasons, but we don't think of them, or at least I don't think of them as political reasons. So when I moved here in the neighborhood where I live now, a police officer once followed me into my driveway, and which I thought was strange. And of course, I thought something was wrong with my house. But of course, I care about myself. I want to be alive. So this police officer's car is who's followed me into my driveway from the main road in my house in our little cul-de-sac, our little neighborhood. This police officer gets out of his car and walks up to my window. Now we're in my driveway that I pay for. And he says, is everything okay? And I say, I hope so. But even in that moment, I had made a decision not to get out of the car, although I was at my house, because I know better than to get out of the car when a police officer pulls up behind you, even if you're at your own house. But that in that moment, I wasn't thinking politically about the police or police violence or social justice or racial justice or equality or inequality. In that moment, I was thinking what a poet thinks, and what a poet thinks is, how do I stay alive? That's what we think in every situation. We think, how do I bring more life to this situation? That's the poets, that's what we're all doing. I think we're doing that in every language.
Yeah. Georg or Yevgeniy. I feel like there is a wide range of aesthetics in the poems that we heard and approaches to this question. So Yevgeniy, how about if you would go next? How do you feel about this? Like if somebody came up to you and said, oh, you're a political poet, how would you feel about that?
Ich glaube, ich würde mich sehr freuen, wenn mir das jemand sagen würde. Ich glaube, ich kann auch Jericho in fast allem zustimmen oder in allem zustimmen, was er gesagt hat. Für mich ist das Wichtigste bei einem Gedicht, dass es natürlich entstehen muss, ätherisch entstehen muss, aus seiner Situation heraus, die ein Bedürfnis widerspiegelt, zu sprechen und das Wahrste zu sprechen, was man sagen kann. Dementsprechend gibt es auch allein in meinen Gedichten auch eine große Spanne von politischen Gedichten oder weniger politischen Gedichten, aber auch allein in mir selbst, weil ich mich manchmal in einer Situation befinde, in der ich ein Bedürfnis habe, mich politisch zu äußern. Und manchmal überwiegt das Private, was natürlich auch politisch sein kann, bei Weitem. Und ich glaube, so wie Jericho es sagt, man darf nichts ausschließen. Und dementsprechend würde ich weder das Politische noch das Private ausschließen in meinem Gedicht.
So I think if somebody would tell me that, I'd be very happy. And generally, I can say I agree on everything that Jericho just said. I think generally poems have to be created or written in a natural way, in an etherical way, out of a situation where you feel the need to express something, to speak, and to speak the most truthful, the most real utterance you can. And this is why I have a wide range and variety of different kinds of poems. I have more political poems, I have less political poems, because in some situations I feel the need to speak, to say somehow to clarify my political position. And in some situations, the private situation or my private feelings that also, of course, can be political are more important. And generally, I think both is just legit and nothing should be excluded, as Jericho says.
Außerdem würde ich mich dagegen wehren, Form und Inhalt wirklich so weit zu trennen, zu sagen, es gibt das politische Sprechen als inhaltliches Sprechen, aber es gibt eine Form, der es bedarf. Ich würde sagen, es gibt auch eine politische Form vom Gedicht genauso. Ein konkretes Gedicht kann sehr politisch sein in einem bestimmten Umfeld. Oder auch ein sehr apolitisches Gedicht kann in einem sehr politischen Umfeld sehr konkret sein. Deswegen würde ich diese Trennung eher nicht begrüßen.
And also, I would refuse to separate between form and content. So it's not only the message, the content that can be political. It's not only a political statement that can be stated or expressed in form, in content, or by the meaning of the words. Also, a form can be very political. For example, concrete poetry in certain situations, in certain contexts, or a political poem can become political in a certain situation, in a certain context. So it really depends on the context, and I would not separate content from form there.
Georg, how would you respond to that comment? Do you see your work as being political or engaged in this contemporary moment, or do you see it as being offering something other than that?
Ich bemerke meistens, dass ich versuche, allzu konkrete Anlässe, die über mein individuelles Erleben hinausgehen, aus Gedichten zu tilgen. Alle meine Gedichte über Masken und den Mundschutz mussten revidiert werden in den letzten Wochen und Monaten. Ich denke, auch Gedichte sind wie Fingerabdrücke und man kann nur begrenzt kontrollieren, was passiert, thematisch, motivisch. Vielleicht kann man auch nicht authentisch schreiben, wenn man allzu bewusst schreibt. Und am Ende ist es auch eine Form von Unterhaltung, was wahrscheinlich immer auch einen politischen Aspekt hat. Ich stelle fest, dass in vielen aktuellen Gedichten Motive von Gewalt auftauchen. Das könnte aber auch an den Filmen liegen, die ich mir ansehe.
So I've noticed that I tried to eliminate too concrete aspects, too concrete details of very personal experience out of my poetry, and somehow also eliminate, for example, masks or face protection throughout the last couple of months and weeks out of my poems. So I'm currently revising them, everything that actually is too specific. I generally think that poems are like fingerprints. So you have limited control with regards to themes and motives of your poetry, because also otherwise, I think maybe you would not be too authentic, or authentic being too aware of what you're writing about. And also, finally, poetry is a form of entertainment, and maybe this also is a political side. It has a political side to it through this. I've noticed also that in my poetry recently there has been a lot of violence. It might be somehow referring to what is surrounding me, but it also might be connected to the films I'm watching.
Well, that idea of poetry as entertainment, I think, is really interesting. I think that brings us to thinking about, so what is it that we want our poetry to do? So if that's one thing that it does, what else do you want to see happen between you and your audience? Or is that even something that you're concerned about? And I leave that open to whoever feels like responding.
Also bei mir zumindest gibt es nichts, was mir bewusst wäre, was ich explizit auslösen möchte, außer ein Mitfühlen und auch Mitfühlen nicht im Sinne nur des Gefühls, sondern wenn ich überlege, dass ich von mir selbst beim Gedichtschreiben erwarte, etwas zu lernen, über mich zu lernen, über die Welt zu lernen durch das Gedicht, wäre für mich wahrscheinlich die beste Wirkung, dass die Leserin mit mir gemeinsam etwas über sich, mich und die Welt herausfindet.
So generally, I wouldn't say there is something very specific that I want to evoke or trigger by my poetry, but maybe compassion not only in the sense of feeling empathy or sympathy, but generally, if I think about myself and the process of writing, for me, it is very important to learn something about myself, about poetry and the world through the process of writing. So I think the best that can happen is when the readers, along with me, learn something through my poetry about themselves, about me, or about the world.
So Sandy, I think your question is sort of a question about audience, right? Who do we expect to read the poems, or what do we expect? This was sort of how we started in the beginning, where I was thinking about the how, like how do our poems work on people? And I think maybe the wonderful thing about being a poet is that you don't get to know. It's really nice to imagine somebody's read I mean, for me at least, that somebody's read the poems and they've lived a completely different life because of the poems, but that I don't ever get to know that. So then what becomes my purpose when I'm writing the poem? I have to write poems that lead me to live a different life, which is why it's so important that you do what you love, and so important that what you love includes what you're very passionate about, you know, what you're obsessed with. So for me, I know in my first book, when I was writing my first book, it was really important that I write to myself when I was 19 years old. That was my audience for that book. I was thinking about a younger me who needed those poems that I was writing in the future in order to survive. I was trying to write the poems that I needed at that time. And I was not, when I was 19 years old, I was not a person in good shape. I think they call these people at risk. So I imagined, well, what poems would I have needed? What would have made my survival more speedy and more to the moment, right? It is also true that part of the reason why I was at risk is 100% political. I didn't think of it at that time, but being able to sort of see myself outside myself, seeing myself in the past, I sort of see the ways in which I intersected, you know, all of these moments of life's traumas. I'm not talking about a specific trauma, but life's traumas. If we look back at many of those moments and we see how they intersect with our citizenry, then we understand that much of my trouble as a very young person had to do with the outside world's idea about me, or my perceived idea of the outside world's idea about me. And it didn't seem possible that the message that I got from the outside world was that that queer people had no business being alive. And I internalized that I had no business being alive. And that is indeed political. But I didn't understand it that way. And I'm not sure if I would have to understand it that way to write poems about it. But I think I do think poems ask us for a certain kind of reflection on the past, which gives us a different lens through which to see it. And sometimes that lens is indeed political, I guess. Yeah.
I wonder how, thinking about poetry as writing back to a younger self or self-reflection, how does it feel then when, say, your poem Bullet Points blows up on Twitter this summer? How did you feel about that community building? I think that poem.
I wish I could say I felt good. The best thing I heard about that poem you know, you think you want that when you're a poet. You're like, ooh, I want my poem to go viral too. Do you know what I mean? Like Maggie Smith's Good Bones, and the way that everybody was sharing that poem. And when Bullet Points was having this moment, and when that moment reappears, you know, every once in a while I see Bullet Points being shared. And I mean, the best compliment I ever got about that poem was from the poet Taya Majest, who said, you know, Jericho, you wrote a poem that's perfect for every Black person's wallet. We should all just keep this in our wallet. And, but then obviously there's something about that that's also very sad, you know? And so, I don't know, I like being able to write something that creates community. At the same time, it is sad for me that I wish I had written Good Bones instead. You know? Writing Bullet Points, when I see that come up, I know someone's been murdered, and that's why it's being shared in that way. I mean, when I start seeing a lot of it, you know, like if I see one, I'm like, cool. But if I scroll and I see Bullet Points 12 times, I'm like, what happened? You know?
Yeah. So you shared this really troubling experience of being in your driveway and being confronted in that way. I'm wondering sort of what the environment is like in the US compared to Germany, as far as, does it feel in Germany, as I think it feels here, that things are building up? You know, certainly with the US election, we're kind of in dread, maybe excited too, but what is going to happen here? And in this term coming up to the election, we've seen white supremacists become very vocal. There was the thing with the Michigan governor. And in Germany, reports are that anti-Semitism is on a similar sort of trajectory. And I wonder with Georg and Yevgeniy, if you feel like that is true with your lived experience, and if so, what is your sense of how things are in Germany now?
Ist ganz sicher wahr, ja, ganz sicher bestehen Fakten in diesem Zusammenhang, die deutlich machen, wie militant bestimmte Bereiche sich entwickeln. Die Exekutive, gerade bei der Polizei, das Ausheben rechtsradikaler Netzwerke, das ist nichts, was man diskutieren müsste. Das sind Fakten.
So it's true. It's obviously true, and the effects of how, in a militant way, and how aggressively these networks and this movement evolves, and all these, in a way, attacks or problems with the executive, with the police authorities in Germany, where different right-wing extremist groups and networks have been detected or are operating. So all of this is a fact. It's true. There's nothing to discuss about that.
Ja, ich denke, in Deutschland sind die Leute in die USA zu schauen und die USA zu verurteilen. Und zu sagen, dass der Rassismus dort weit ausgeprägter war als hier, was ich aber nicht glaube. Ich glaube, dass der Rassismus in Deutschland einfach auf eine andere Art und Weise vielleicht, eine ähnliche, aber ein bisschen andere ausgeprägt ist. Und ohne den direkten Vergleich zu haben, wäre mein Gefühl, dass es teilweise sogar für People of Color in Deutschland noch schwieriger sein wird, weil sie noch weniger als Teil der Gesellschaft wahrgenommen werden als in den USA, wo es für die Leute weit weniger eine Rolle spielt, welche Hautfarbe man hat. Und ich glaube, in Deutschland ist man da zum Beispiel noch nicht so weit.
So in Germany, people like to look at the US and condemn their racism, and the racism in the US, and it is generally commonly acknowledged or seen as the racism in the US is much worse and much more prevalent than in Germany, for example. But I don't think it's true. I think actually the problem of racism is just as prevalent in Germany. Maybe it expresses itself, or it is expressed in different ways and different forms. But there is a very similar level of racism in Germany. And I would say, I don't have the personal experience, but I would say, or I would assume that for people of color, for example, in Germany, it is actually much more difficult to get along and be part of society, because it's not as much something given as in the US, where it doesn't matter what skin color you have, because somehow it is generally recognized or acknowledged by the society, and in Germany it isn't.
Can I ask a question for our German poets in particular? In Germany, do you feel, as poets, I know I feel this way about poetry in English, but do you feel there is a history or a tradition of poetry that is set up for you in this moment? So if this is a particularly tense and intense moment in Germany, are there poems that you feel like from some time long ago still speak to the fact of this moment in spite of the fact they're from long ago? So that's sort of my first question. And then my second question has to do with the fact of community among poets. Do you feel in these intense moments that there is indeed a poetry community in Germany, and that community, that the community of poets is in agreement about their reaction or even their resistance to such a moment?
Vielleicht zur ersten Frage. Es gibt ja immer wieder Zeitpunkte in der Geschichte, in denen eine Form von Gewaltexplosion bevorsteht, vor den Weltkriegen beispielsweise. Und in diesen Vorzeiträumen findet man selbstverständlich Gedichte, die eine Form von Vorahnung transportieren, wird es besonders den Expressionismus betreffen, in dem man dann möglicherweise auch eine ähnliche Radikalität, eine ähnliche Drastik findet im Zusammenhang mit Gewalt, was mich jetzt konkret interessieren würde.
Oh, you're muted, Irina.
Concerning the first question, there have been moments in history before, on the eve of an explosion, so briefly before the explosion or eruption of massive violence, for example, of the world wars, where poets somehow have or had foreseen this explosion, and they had some kind of a hunch that this would happen. And for me, for example, the expressionist movement, the expressionist poetry is such poetry that somehow foresees what's to come, or what kind of doom, what kind of explosion and violence is to come.
Yevgeniy, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your experience as a Jewish immigrant and as a young man in Germany? How did you feel that you were received when you came? At what age were you when you moved to Germany?
Als ich mit meinen Eltern nach Deutschland gezogen bin, war ich 10 Jahre alt und war mir noch nicht darüber bewusst, was es bedeutet, Jude zu sein, weil wir meine Eltern es vermieden haben, mit mir darüber zu reden, aus Angst vor Antisemitismus in der Ukraine. Dann in Deutschland haben wir angefangen zu praktizieren und ich habe mir ein Bild davon gemacht und habe auch mein Judentum als etwas erfahren, das permanent eine Rolle gespielt hat, egal ob es positiv oder negativ war. Und für mich hat es dazu geführt, dass ich mich sehr stark von solchen Identitäten wie Jude oder Immigrant oder anderen distanziert habe und überhaupt ein Problem habe mit identitären Zuweisungen. Und zumindest finde ich es bemerkenswert und fragwürdig, dass es nicht aufhört, eine Rolle zu spielen. Andererseits verstehe ich das natürlich, weil Deutschland hat die Geschichte des Holocaust und das muss immer eine Rolle spielen. Es ist schwierig, damit einen Umgang zu finden.
So I was 10 when I moved to Germany with my parents, and I was not aware of my identity as a Jew back then because my parents wouldn't talk to me about it. In Ukraine, fearing anti-Semitism, and when we came to Germany, we started observing and practicing Judaism. And then throughout my upbringing, all through my being a teenager and growing up in Germany, it always had played a role, whether it's a positive role or a negative role, whether it was about negative stereotypes or positive ones. Somehow it led to me generally distancing myself from this part of my identity, or generally distancing myself and refusing to identify as a Jew or as an immigrant, and to being highly skeptical of these kinds of identifications. And I still do think that it is remarkable and also strange that these kinds of identities still play such a big role in Germany, although it is also understandable because of the history of Germany, because of the Holocaust. But generally, I have a very difficult take on it, or a very difficult position, and it's very difficult still for me to deal with it.
Was something that you mentioned earlier, Yevgeniy, with your sense of what happens when you write, with the discovery process, with connection, with learning, with compassion. I think there's a connection there with, so we've been talking about sort of internal divisiveness within Germany, within the US, but of course there's the international as well. And it seems to me that compassion itself is a very political act. And especially at this moment, we see these images of the US of immigrant children, babies even being taken away from their parents, placed in cages. There is this incredible sort of isolationism happening now. And I wonder about all of this in the connection to poetry and the art of translation itself. And this is for everybody, maybe for us to think about. So at another event yesterday, Ilya Kaminsky mentioned that if you look at what's published in the US each year, something like 3% of everything that's published is translated literature, whereas in Germany, it's in the high double digits. So what does that tell us about us? And what do you think that we can do as poets to address that? Or do you think that that's even something that we should be concerned about?
I heard Ilya say that. I mean, Ilya and I have talked, we talk about poetry all the time. So I heard him say that yesterday, and it's something we've talked about a great deal, but I do think it is poets' responsibility to be as capacious as you can possibly be as a human being. And I do think it's poets' responsibility to know that there are other languages in other lands. And yet I don't know it's their responsibility to make translations happen. Your translation should happen because your editor is fierce about supporting and promoting your work. And what we have, I mean, I'm really sorry to say this, but I'll say it, I'm sure maybe I shouldn't have started talking. I should have planned this better. But we do have a way of publication in this industry in the United States. We have this thing about getting something out. Like the goal is, I put a book out. Now I can apply for a job, I got a book out. As if having a book out somehow means you are going to heaven on the blood of Jesus. It's like, no. Do you know what I'm saying? Having a book is not the end of this like, big congrats on your book. But there has to be, at the level of the journals, the publishers, at the level of the bookstores, at the level of all that we are as a conglomeration, people out. The poets are clearly there's no poet saying no to translation. There is no American poet. If a Swede came to an American poet and said, will you let me translate this? You know what every American poet is going to say? Yes. So the slowdown is not with the poets. Do you know what I mean? That slowdown has to do with the fact that we do not have about us a sense of work that we promote and fight for, that we spread, that we proliferate throughout the world. And in the United States, I don't know about how people feel about poetry all over. Poetry is probably the stepchild everywhere, right? It's the genre stepchild. And yet, everybody needs it. It's the art form that over and over again, we find when we read a poem, we see a need has been fulfilled that we did not even know we needed. Right? When we find that poem we love, it fulfills a need. And so we would have to have a different set of people interested in doing a different kind of influencing other than simply making something. There are a lot of presses, you know this, Sandy. There are a lot of presses in the United States. Their schedule is the fact of printing books. And if I just wanted my book printed, I would go to Kinko's. Do you know what I'm saying? I got a copy machine at my job. Do you follow what I mean? And so there has to be something else. The poets do need to join in that. It's nice when you have a poet for a press. It's nice when the poet is interested in giving readings or in traveling or in some way promoting his or her work. But what is the publisher's job? And what is the job also? What is the critic's job? What is the scholar's job? Recently, when Louise Glick won the Nobel Prize, it became quite clear to me. Well, I'll tell you something. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long at this point, so I'll say these two things and I'll stop. Often I get emails from people, or usually social media messages from people, DMs from people, or ads from people, mentions in which they say, when are you coming to Cleveland? When are you coming to Denver? I hope you come to Denver. I can't wait to see you in Montana. As if I have power over Montana. The person asking me to come to Montana lives in Montana and probably has more resources for bringing me to Montana than anybody else would, other than the other people in Montana who that person knows. Do you understand what I mean? And the same thing about how we make things happen in this world. We have to have people writing about poetry. There has to be literal letters and American letters. We have to have more people promoting that which is written about poetry. We have to have people writing about contemporary poetry in real time. We have to have publishers seeking out translators, making collaborative efforts with translators on purpose. We don't have that. And that's not about the poets. I mean, my sense of the poets is that the poets always want more, so.
Yeah, and I feel like that happens so much more with prose, that especially because it's money, right? There's a sense that, oh, here's a big novel, and so why don't we go ahead and get a translator and see if we can make money in Europe and Spain, etc.
Yeah.
And nobody really thinks that with poetry.
Yeah.
I wonder, Georg and Yevgeniy, I mean, do you feel a similar sort of way being a poet in Germany, that that there's not a lot of support for the sort of marketing distribution of your work, or do you feel like it's a different thing? I know when we went to the Berlin Poetry Festival, I mean, it was such a fabulous event, and there were government partners, yes, and that's something I think that you don't see very often in the US. So I just wonder what your experience and feeling is about that, either with your publishers or just the climate in Germany. Do you feel that you are supported in any way, or are you just sort of left on your own with your books from Kinko's, like Jericho was describing?
Ja, ich glaube, man beschwert sich in Deutschland sehr viel, aber gleichzeitig ich denke nicht, dass in vielen Ländern auf der Welt bessere Strukturen zur Unterstützung von so etwas Abwegigen wie Gedichten sind als in Deutschland. Ich fühle mich sehr gut aufgehoben, sowohl was die Verlage angeht, als auch die mögliche Stipendien und Förderstrukturen, überhaupt die Community und alles andere. Zu der Frage davor möchte ich doch nochmal hinzufügen, dass ich es durchaus als Verantwortung von mir als Dichter sehe, zu wissen, was der aktuelle Stand in der Dichtung ist. Und das bedeutet nicht nur in der deutschen Dichtung, sondern auch in anderen Ländern. Und dementsprechend ist es mir wichtig, auch fremdsprachige Poesie zu lesen. Und wenn das nicht übersetzt wird, dann muss ich eben die Sprache lernen und das selbst übersetzen oder die Sprache lernen und das einfach lesen. Und ich denke, es ist durchaus wichtig, außerhalb der Community zu gucken. Und wenn die Community eben das Land ist, dann außerhalb des Landes.
So I think generally we like to complain. We like to complain very much, but I think there are hardly many countries as like Germany, where poetry is as well funded, and even something as unlikely as poetry actually has structures, speaking about publishers, also scholarships, the community, and generally funds and support. So I really think Germany is in a very good situation, or I as a poet in Germany am in a very good situation rather. And with regards to the previous question, I have to say that I, as a poet, feel that I have responsibility to inform myself about the state of the art in poetry, which means that I need to keep myself updated on poetry, not only in my own language, but also in other languages and on a global level. And if there are no translations, I need to learn the languages, and I need to read poetry and what's going on around the world. As a poet, I need to look outside, to think outside of the box and look beyond my own community as a poet.
I feel like, and this is a great generalization, but I feel that American poets are just not that far along as far as embracing the full world and thinking that it's an obligation that we make all of these connections. I think we're too complacent and stay in our own little place. Georg, would you agree with Yevgeniy as far as the experience, what it's like being a poet in Germany?
Ja, da stimme ich in den meisten Punkten zu. Persönlich bin ich auch nicht unzufrieden mit der Situation, bin mir bewusst, dass vieles durch Selbstausbeutung von Verlegerinnen beispielsweise geschieht und geschehen kann. Im Bereich Lyrikkritik gibt es zum Beispiel mit dem Haus für Poesie eine Aktion, die jetzt schon einige Jahre abläuft, die Lyrik-Kritik-Akademie, der Versuch, spezielle Lyrikkritiker und Kritikerinnen heranzuzüchten. Ich denke auch, dass Lyrik außerhalb von Deutschland zum Teil interessanter ist als Lyrik innerhalb von Deutschland, beispielsweise in Österreich, wo glücklicherweise aber dieselbe Sprache gesprochen wird.
So in most of their aspects, I would agree with Yevgeniy. Generally, I would say I'm not unhappy with the situation, and I know that a lot is possible, amongst others, thanks to self-exploitation by publishers, for example, that publish poetry on a non-financed basis or non-commercial basis. And also there are different initiatives. For example, the House of Poetry has an initiative which is called Academy for Poetry Criticism, which is an attempt of growing critics of poetry, so of basically promoting poetry. Generally, I am aware of the fact that probably current poetry and contemporary poetry outside of Germany is more interesting than inside of Germany. For example, in Austria, now the community and the scene is really very interesting, but fortunately, they also write in German.
Well, and I think that, I mean, that's sort of a horrific thing about being an American poet, the English language, the great success of English colonialism that took the English language so many places that perhaps it's easier for us to be complacent. Think, oh, well, we're reading international work because I'm reading English work in Africa. I'm reading English work, you know, in Australia, etc. I wonder if at this point we might kind of bring some of the audience questions into this and just kind of continue the conversation. We have a question about the US's lack of translated work. And the question is, do you think that might actually be contributing to xenophobia or racism in America? So sort of like, you know, the chicken or the egg thing. How do those two relate? Whoever feels like addressing that. Do you feel like the lack of translated literature actually worsens xenophobia in the US, or certainly elsewhere, though, as we have seen, it's not the same kind of issue in Germany as it is in the US?
Definitely. I mean, definite yes to that. I mean, we're in, you know, this is where the word systemic comes from. We're in a real, I mean, it's a pickle. We are really in a system where dismantling it means starting over in so many ways. There are some things we can improve upon, but there are some things that we would not ever be able to improve upon because of just the base of the structure, the foundations of the structure. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for instance, is so individual, and it asks something of a self. I mean, even the phrase, you know, asks something of the self. You know, there are other countries where when you hear their mottos and their sayings, you hear words like fraternity. You know, we don't have that. Do you know what I'm saying? And because of that, we're always looking at ourselves. And if that can happen in the macro, if that happens for the nation, then that's happening for the individual. If you look at yourself enough, you never see anybody else. So you're not really learning about yourself because you haven't had the experiences with other people to better learn how you interact with folks. So yeah, of course, I agree with that, yes. Yeah, in the United States, if we were to read poems in other languages, it might become clear to us that healthcare is a right. We might actually believe that nobody deserves to die because they got sick. Do you know what I mean? If we were to read poems in other languages, we might be under the impression that if somebody gets murdered, the first question we ask in this country when somebody gets murdered is, what did they do? We do not ask about the murderer. We ask about the person who got murdered in this nation. What did the victim of the murder do to deserve to be murdered? Because they're dead, they must have deserved it. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, if we read things in other languages, maybe that would change.
Certainly with too. I mean, there's
Auch nicht nur das Schlechte zu betonen. Ich habe, glaube ich, vor einer Woche diese Ausgabe von Poetry in einem deutschen Buchladen entdeckt. Und das ist definitiv übersetzt und nicht amerikanisch. Und dafür möchte ich die USA dann doch auch loben.
So I don't only want to point out the negative, and in order to also emphasize something positive, this magazine called Poetry, I found recently, 1 week ago, I bought it from in a German bookstore. And this magazine, obviously dedicated to poetry, is not English-speaking poetry. So it is a translation. It consists completely out of translations. So I would also give somehow say props to the US and also point this out. There are translations.
Is that poetry magazine? Is that, it's not the same poetry as?
Yeah, it's yours. Yeah.
It's yours. It's our poetry magazine.
Okay, well that brings up the whole poetry can of worms then, doesn't it?
This is,
Well, the only can of worms that brings up to me.
or maybe it's not translated. I have to check.
Okay.
Well, maybe I'll reserve my comment for the check then.
So I just saw that flash, the Global Indian. Is that what it said? So perhaps not translated?
And it's about the tradition in the end. There's a text about eine Kritik.
Must be a review. That's nice.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting that there is sort of not an industry, a kind of cultural value of criticism in Germany as well, that would be something that you would want to try to promote, the writing about poetry. I don't think that that's something that we have here so much. It's not that much writing about poetry, except for perhaps the big books of the year.
Ja, vielleicht
Another, yeah, please.
Da gibt es doch etwas, was die USA Deutschland meiner Meinung nach sehr voraus hat. Wir haben vielleicht sowas wie die Lyrikkritikakademie, das ist eine Sache, aber das Verständnis davon, dass man schreiben lernen und lehren kann, ist in den USA viel weiter ausgebildet. Es gibt beinahe an jeder Universität eine Creative Writing Class und in Deutschland gibt es nur 2 Universitäten, an denen man das studieren kann. Das ist überhaupt nicht üblich und das liegt daran, glaube ich, dass in Deutschland immer noch so ein Verständnis davon da ist, dass Autorinnen so etwas Genieartiges verkörpern müssten, das originär wäre und nicht beigebracht werden kann. Und das ist ja etwas auch sehr Elitäres. Und da, finde ich, ist etwas, was man der USA sehr hoch anrechnen kann, dass zumindest an diesem Elitären sehr stark gerüttelt wurde und gesagt wurde, doch, ihr könnt schreiben, lernen und wir können euch das beibringen. Ja.
So just to add a couple of words, I think there is something where the US is ahead of Germany. It is maybe there are initiatives such as the Academy for Poetry Criticism, but generally there is not such a broad awareness of the fact that you can learn how to write. And in the US, almost every university has their own creative writing department. In Germany, there are 2 institutes where you can learn how to write, or generally with dedicated to creative writing. And generally it comes from an understanding of a writer, an author as a genius, as somebody with their own genuine thoughts, original thoughts that come from somewhere, and not a craft that you have to master somehow and to hone. And of course, also this is quite elitist. And I think in the US, it is very different, and we have to acknowledge that.
That the poetry world in the United States is more democratic or less elitist than it is in Germany. Yeah, probably.
So we have opened it up for questions now. So we will all be able to see your questions if you post them in the chat. So please do that. We do have a translator. If you would like to post your question in German, that's fine as well, either way. Okay, so let's see, the next question. What is your impression of non-native English speakers who write poetry in English? Do you have an idea about poets agreeing upon a communal language, not necessarily English, and exercise therein with the effect of incapacities in that foreign language to creating a poetic form itself, exactly not being correctly spoken, written? Okay, so I think the gist of it is sort of writing in a language, even though you're not fluent in it, if that would perhaps build more community, if they're finding some kind of common ground in language. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Well, I think one issue is, I mean, we all love our languages, right? And to give up the richness of each individual language might be an issue there. The next one is, what is the process of translating the sentiment of words into another language like? So this is getting at not just the sort of denotative meaning, right? But sort of the heart of it, the emotion of it.
That was the, for me, that was the best part about what we did when we were in Germany together, particularly working with Georg's work, because he's so ironic and he has such dry humor and wit in all of his poems. And there are always these moments, even in the love poems, but there are these moments where it's really a kind of very humorous irony that is always surprising and comes out of nowhere. It's always fresh and surprising. And so, and I couldn't see that at first because all we were looking at is what we call the gloss, you know, and interpret it straight up line by line. But it was clear to me that something was going on because things weren't making sense. And so one of the things that I loved most about translating Georg's poem in particular is figuring out, which I don't often get to do in my dour ass poems, but it gave me the opportunity of figuring out how to use satire, how to use humor, how to use irony in ways that I hadn't used them recently. And what always, what was interesting to me about that is that in order to, I found myself in one particular case, I'd have to look at it to see the case exactly, but I remember finding myself in one particular case where I didn't say exactly what he had said in the poem. I don't know if he's still mad at me about that, but when I said it, people laughed, which he's like nodding his head like, yes, I'm mad at you about that. But it was important because the interpreter in Georg was like, this has to be funny. I was like, there's no way I can make that funny in English. So I was like, what if we make it this instead? And Georg's like, why are you trying to rewrite my poem? So, but that was, for me, that is when things felt most collaborative. And when I really felt like it wasn't just me, I was really trying to carry Georg inside me in order to write the poems, in order to translate the poems.
Und im Grunde bringt uns das fast zu der ersten gestellten Frage zurück, weil die Gefahr beim Übersetzen von Jerichos Gedichten darin lag, dass ich die Sprache natürlich in den Grundzügen verstanden habe und dadurch verführt war, exakt zu übersetzen. Und Jericho konnte etwas ausführlicher mutieren und nachbilden auf einer ganz anderen Ebene.
And this brings us also back to the very first question. The danger while translating Jericho's texts for me, or poems for me, was that I could understand the wording, I could understand the meaning. So translating exactly word by word was more of a risk or a danger for me, while Jericho could get away from the meaning and could mutate my poems or let them mutate freely and be more expressive and try to translate them or transform them on different levels.
We have another question here about hearing your own work in translation, if that makes you feel differently about rhythm or form or any aspects of your own poetry, hearing it in translation. Yevgeniy, do you have anything with that?
Also für mich ist es ein großes Glück, mich in einer anderen Sprache im Gedicht genauso wiederzuerkennen und zu sehen, dass es vielleicht etwas gibt, was außersprachlich ist, was transportiert werden kann und das auch gar nicht so kompliziert.
So for me personally, it made me very happy. It was a great fortune to hear my poems in a different language and to recognize myself in these poems in a different language, and maybe also to see that there is something that can be transported which is beyond language itself.
Oh, we'll just take the last couple questions on here. We have about 5 more minutes. There's a question about, what do you think the duty of the poet is in our climate? What do you think the poetry reader should be today, the duty of the poetry reader? Poetry seems to be a passive form, but it has the power to move. What's your vision to creating this active reality?
I think the poet only has one responsibility, and that is to tell the truth. And I think in moments like this, whatever moments like this is, poets maybe more than anybody else have to realize that this moment is not exceptional, that this moment has been happening, and that we're in the midst. This is not the first time the United States ignored a pandemic. So poets the poet's responsibility is to tell the truth no matter the moment. And if they're telling the truth no matter the moment, when moments like this arise, they're just doing what they always do. And other people become aware of it. And then the job of the reader is to be open to the poem beyond emotion toward action. People are often going to poems for meditative practice, which is wonderful, or to calm themselves. But poems can, I believe if poems are doing what they are meant to do, then they move us emotionally, they make us cry, they make us laugh, they make us angry. And if you are properly moved emotionally, you will begin to think differently. And if you indeed think differently, you will act, and you will act differently. So that's, I think it has to do with how vulnerable you allow yourself to be to the poems you are reading.
Vielleicht ist das der Grund, warum so wenig Gedichte gelesen werden, wenn man sagt, dass Fake News sich 6-mal schneller ausbreiten als richtige Nachrichten. Und wenn man jetzt sagt, dass Gedichte noch wahrer sind, wie Jericho sagt, als das normale.
Oh.
They stopped him. They stopped him before he could tell the truth.
So he just said, maybe this is the reason why so few people read poetry. There are statistics that fake news spread 6 times faster than real news and actual news and facts. And maybe if poetry is even more true, more truthful than news, than facts, this is why even fewer people read poetry.
And in this moment, really, what could be more political than truth-telling, or being willing to read something and be open to the truth? We have just 1 minute left. Would anyone like to make a closing comment on that before we wrap it up? Yevgeniy, Georg, Jericho?
Can Yevgeniy finish what he was saying?
Yeah, that would be great, Yevgeniy.
When did I stop being connected?
I think right after. I think right after the fake news and that it spreads faster than poetry, faster than real news, and poetry is probably even more true than real news, and therefore that's why it does not spread. Was that?
Yeah. The point was, that's why we should start lying more. That was my point. In poems.
Sandy, thank you so much for hosting this for us. Thank you to Berry College. Thank you, Mary Boyd. I really appreciate being here, and it's good to be with Yevgeniy and Georg again. And I can't wait to see everyone tomorrow night at our event at Emory University.
Yeah.
At 6 p.m.?
At 6 p.m.
Wonderful.
More Poetry Festival, more Translation Summit. Thank y'all so much.
No, thank you too.
very much.
Bye. Bye.
Good to see you all. Thank you all for coming.